The real worry I have is that when there's any counteroffensive, which there will be, that Ukraine doesn't really have air superiority. And I've said a number of times that control of the air was one of the prime factors which led to success in land operations in the 20th century.
Very glad to welcome into the briefing room now Major General Chip Chapman, former senior British military advisor to the US Central Command. Chip, hi.
Good evening, John.
Always good to have you here, Chip. Just on your thinking over the weekend, the latest state of play in the war in Ukraine, what are your thoughts on how things are sitting there now?
Well, I think Russia's got problems in its deep battle, and we've seen that sort of striking out again post the whatever happened in terms of the drone strikes on Moscow last week, with this fairly large barrage of missiles all over the country in Ukraine. And of course, what is really significant is the Kinzhal missile being shot down by Patriot missiles. And we have to really go back to why this capability is here now. And that really arose from the 8th Contact Group in January, when the Americans, the Dutch and the Germans not only said that they provide Patriot batteries, of which is a minimum of 3, but they'd also provide the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, a shorter and medium-range system. And the Germans would also provide IRIS-T and also French and Italian short-range missiles. And it's a bit of a myth that Russia's using hypersonic missiles. Now, the Kinzhal is a very fast missile. It's a ballistic missile, and a ballistic missile goes Mach 5, and that's very convenient to remember at 3,838 miles an hour. But it's the difference between a real hypersonic missile and the Kinzhal is really to do with speed and maneuverability. So it's old tech with good marketing. It is not really a hypersonic missile.
Right.
And therefore, it seems that Ukraine do have the capability to knock a lot of these down. And most of the attacks, of course, were with the Shahed 136s, the Iranian-supplied drones, and they're pretty easy to knock down. And I believe everyone which was targeted at Kiev was knocked down.
Right, so more than just symbolic value in seeing Ukraine knock down this powerful missile using an American-supplied Patriot. How strong a defense is this for Ukraine, though, Chip? What's the supply of Patriots available to Ukraine? Because obviously Russia still have a pretty powerful capacity in terms of what they can throw over.
I think they have a diminishing capacity, and it's the real worry I have is that when there's any counteroffensive, which there will be, that Ukraine doesn't really have air superiority. And I've said a number of times that control of the air was one of the prime factors which led to success in land operations in the 20th century. So you're always going to be vulnerable to air operations, not the attacks on the cities. But Russia at the moment seems to be using cheap guide bomb kits with a range of 40 to 70 kilometers, which is beyond the short-range air defense of Ukraine. And if you've got complex maneuvers over, for example, rivers or obstacle crossing belts, that makes the Ukrainians vulnerable. So that's my worry about really the air domain, not so much the deep battle missile attacks, because we've already seen that the sort of what was the campaign on the critical national infrastructure, freezing the Ukrainians into submission, has failed. Now they've moved on to this sort of trying to really take out some of the logistics of the Ukrainians in the same way that we're seeing the Ukrainians do that to the Russians, particularly with the attacks on both fuel depots and rail networks in both Russia and in Belarus in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, now you mentioned the counteroffensive, the offensive, the counteroffensive. We talk about that every time we speak now because we sit and wait. And you'll have seen, I'm sure, that Peter Pavel, the Czech leader, has urged Ukraine not to rush, as he argued, prematurely into the counteroffensive. Now he's speaking as you'll know, as an experienced military commander. He's a retired general. He was a NATO advisor. But does Ukraine need that kind of advice?
I don't think they do. They've already wargamed this with the Americans as well, General Cavoli, so they know what kit they need. They've done the sums on that, so they'll know when to go. I think the impediment at the moment is, to use the dreadful term, which I don't think has been heard before, they need the advice of a pedologist, which is a soil scientist, to know if the ground is going to bear the weight of some of the Western supplied tanks. So it's partly weather and pedologist based. Will the soil support the offensive so that they're not stuck in the mud.
Yeah.
And secondly, have they got the training, the equipment, the manpower, the doctrine, and the sustainability? Because a lot of this is about logistics.
Yes.
And what they'll be trying to do is really cut the logistics of the Russians so that they wither on the vine and sort of die in place in a way. And that's what great generals do. They won't be trying to do a Bakhmut type assault in the way that Prigozhin has been doing for the last 10 months in Bakhmut.
Yes. I mean, you would go along with it's a pretty general analysis now that when it comes, Ukraine will have one go at this, one chance on this counteroffensive. The ammunition would have been amassed and got into place. The logistics will be there, the supply lines, the fuel and so on. But it can't fail. They won't be able to do it again this year. Is that your view?
I don't think they'll be able to do it at scale again this year. But like all these things, Biden, for example, has said that they'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And there was another $350 million package last week of significant artillery, air defense systems, and things like missiles and things like that. So a lot of these things are really in the domain of what are the politics of 2024 going to look like, both internally in America and other major allies, internationally, and the perceptions of Russia again for the future. Do we still see them as trying to destroy ultimately the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Right. I want to go back, if I can, to something that Peter Pavel, the Czech leader, was saying earlier, which is that the European Union could help supply Ukraine with what it needs, and it should source ammunition from countries, he argued, that might not want to admit supplying the ammunition, and maybe other countries that EU leaders may feel embarrassed to be dealing with. What did he have in mind with that?
Well, there's a number of countries around the world where there are stockpiles of American ammunition, and of course, lots of the major systems are there. So, for example, we know that they've sourced ammunition, artillery ammunition, from Pakistan, of which the quality has not been as good as some of the European. We know that they've gone to stocks in Israel, although there was some reluctance there. They know that they've gone to stockpiles in South Korea there, should there ever be a conflict in the Korean Peninsula. Really what we need to do, and we know the Americans are doing this, is energizing the industrial base, because this is also partly a war of an industry and GDPs. And on that basis, we believe that the Americans by themselves, and ultimately the Europeans, should they energize their industrial base, will outproduce the Russians by a quantum order. And that is one of the two things that the Americans said last week in the Senate Armed Services Committee. Avril Haines, who I've referenced a number of times as the Director of National Intelligence, that Russia needs really two things for the future. Firstly, it's not going to go any further unless it has a mandatory mobilization. And secondly, it needs to source third-party ammunition supplies, if it's not to just wither on the vine in this defensive posture,
yes,
let alone go onto an offence in the future.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much I'd like to talk to you about. I've only got time for one more point. Evgeny Prigozhin, the commander of the Wagner Group, the sort of private army that he commands in Ukraine and has commanded for some time in other places, other theatres too. He's been berating the Russian High Command and the Defence Ministry. What do you make of that? He's done it before. Is this just part of the sort of chaotic fringe to the Russian invasion?
I don't think it's quite that. Now, what he's trying to do is procure 300 tons of ammunition per day. He's only been getting 100 at the moment because his casualties incrementally increase when you don't have the artillery firepower to suppress the enemy. We know that he's going to get that. And what Prigozhin's trying to do, and the Russians, because we know that Surovikin now is going to be the Wagner MOD liaison officer, what he's trying to do is minimize his casualties and also try to take Bakhmut, hopefully before tomorrow, but he won't do that, so that Russia can be presented with a victory. It doesn't have anything, and it needs at least something, tenuously or not, before the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians takes place.
Yes.
This is the second sort of strawman that Prigozhin has done. A strawman is when you put suggestions out there to see what the reaction is. The first one, of course, was that we should have a sort of ceasefire, and we've done as much as we can. That was wrongly interpreted. What he really wanted to do was increase the nationalistic fervor for a national mobilization.
Yes.
That's really what he's aiming at, not the fact that we should sort of stick and not twist for the future.
Yeah, and you mentioned tomorrow being May the 9th, which is an important date in the Russian calendar. We should be ready, I suppose, for something appalling.
I'm not sure. I mean, we've had the attacks today. Last year, they didn't. That was a stamp squib. It'll be interesting to see what turns out on the ground, I think. So Shoigu, the defense minister, said that there would be a minimum of 10,000 people, 10,000 troops and 125 vehicles. That's smaller than last year. We'll see, because what they have got rid of is the imperial regiment marches, because they didn't want the notion of the casualties of Ukraine showing the pictures of their loved ones who've been killed, and that would not go down well in terms of the information campaign and controlling that in Russia.
Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.